The storm had been building for hours before it finally broke over the yacht like a fist closing around a throat. Clara Vance stood near the railing in a silk dress that had cost more than most people's monthly wages, watching lightning fork across a sky the color of a fresh bruise. And she thought, not for the first time that night, that she had never once in her 28 years felt as alone as she did surrounded by 200 of her family's closest business associates. Below deck, the party continued. Champagne kept flowing. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. Julian Ashford Whitmore, her fiancé and the man who ran half of her father's shipping conglomerate with the other half firmly in his own pocket, moved through the crowd shaking hands, accepting congratulations on their upcoming wedding, playing the role of devoted partner with the ease of a man who had never once meant a word of it. Clara had begun to suspect that months ago. Tonight, she was certain. Their engagement had been announced 18 months earlier with the kind of fanfare reserved for the merger of two dynasties rather than the union of two people, which, Clara had come to understand, was exactly what it was. Her father, in the last months of his illness, had approved of Julian without hesitation, a rising star within the company, sharp and capable and, most importantly to a dying man worried about his empire, unshakably loyal. Clara had wanted, badly, to believe her father had been right about at least one thing before he died. She had told herself the coldness she sometimes felt from Julian was simply the reserve of a man raised to keep his emotions private, the same way she'd been raised. She had told herself a great many things in the 2 years since her father's funeral to avoid sitting alone with how lonely she actually was. She had found the documents 3 days earlier, tucked into a folder Julian had left open on his tablet while he showered. Transfer agreements, voting proxies, a restructuring of her father's estate that would leave her, on paper, the face of the company and, in practice, powerless within it. All of it dated for signature the week after the wedding. All of it bearing signatures that looked remarkably like her own, though she had never put pen to any of it. She had told no one. She had smiled through dinner. She had planned to fly home in the morning and call her father's old attorney, a man Julian didn't know existed. She never got the chance. The deckhand who approached her near the stern wore a crew uniform she didn't recognize, and by the time she registered that the ship's actual crew were all below decks sheltering from the weather, his hand was already at the small of her back, firm and unhurried, guiding her toward the railing as though he meant to point out something in the dark water. She opened her mouth to ask what he was doing, and the deck pitched beneath her. Or he pushed, she would never be entirely sure which, and in the end it hardly mattered. And then there was only black water rushing up to meet her, and the shriek of wind swallowing whatever sound she made on the way down. The cold hit her like a wall. Salt filled her mouth. The yacht's lights receded above her, swallowed by rain and distance, and no one on board so much as glanced toward stern. 40 minutes north, in weather any sane man would have stayed home for, Elias Thorne fought his boat back toward the marina with his jaw set and his daughter's future riding on every line he checked twice. The Seahawk wasn't much. 32 feet of aging fiberglass that had been his father's before was his, but she was paid off, and paid off meant Maya had a roof, and a roof was the only thing that mattered to Elias Thorne anymore. He almost missed her, a shape in the water, pale against black, there and then gone beneath a swell. He cut the engine harder than he should have, some old Coast Guard instinct taking over before his mind had finished processing what his eyes had seen, and he was over the side with a line clipped to his harness before he'd fully decided to go. She was barely breathing when he hauled her aboard. Beautiful, even half-drowned, in a dress that told him everything he needed to know about the kind of life she'd fallen out of, the kind of life that had never once had cause to notice men like him. He didn't think about that on the water. On the water, there was only the drill, clear the airway, get her breathing, get her warm, get her to shore. He performed compressions with hands that had done it before, years ago, for strangers who hadn't all made it, and when she coughed up seawater and gasped her first ragged breath, he felt something in his chest unclench that he hadn't known was locked. He radioed the harbor, then thought better of it. A woman dressed like that, thrown from a yacht in a storm. That wasn't an accident. He wanted broadcast on an open channel until he understood it. He brought her instead to the only place he trusted completely, his own small house on the bluff above the cove, where his daughter slept and where nothing bad had ever been allowed to happen. Clara woke to lamplight and the smell of wood smoke, wrapped in blankets that smelled of salt and cedar, in a room too plain and too warm to be anything she recognized. Panic came first, sharp and immediate, until the events of the night reassembled themselves in her mind. The documents, the hand at her back, the water, and panic gave way to something colder. Someone had tried to kill her. Someone close enough to arrange it without her ever seeing it coming. The man in the doorway was broad-shouldered and weathered, dressed in a flannel gone soft with age, watching her with an expression that held more suspicion than welcome. "You're lucky," he said, in a voice like gravel. Another 10 minutes out there, and luck wouldn't have mattered. She opened her mouth to thank him, to explain, and stopped. If Julian believed her dead, that was the safest thing in the world for her to be, for now. "I don't," she started, and let her voice catch, let the confusion in it be real, because most of it was. "I don't remember my name." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. She remembered everything. She simply couldn't afford, yet, to say so. Elias studied her for a long moment. The crack in his stoicism said he half didn't believe her, that a woman with hands as soft as hers and a manner as careful as hers didn't lose herself so easily. But he was not a man who turned away someone in need, whatever he suspected, and so he only said, "Then I guess you'll stay here until it comes back to you," and went to check on his daughter, leaving Clara alone with the crackle of the fire and the enormity of what she'd just agreed to. She called herself Ellie the first morning because it was close enough to true that she wouldn't forget to answer to it. The little girl who found her at the kitchen table, 6 years old, dark-haired, missing her 2 front teeth, regarded her with the frank, unguarded curiosity only children are capable of. "Are you a mermaid?" Maya asked. "Daddy pulled you out of the ocean." "I don't think so," Clara said, surprising herself with a smile. "But I might have been a very bad sailor." Maya laughed, delighted, and climbed into the chair across from her without asking permission. And something in Clara, something that had gone quiet and careful a long time ago, around the same time she'd learned that most people wanted something from her, loosened just slightly at the sound. The days that followed were unlike any Clara had known. She, who had never once cooked a meal or mended a seam, burned the first 3 attempts at breakfast and stabbed herself twice learning to sew a button back onto one of Maya's dresses. And Elias watched her fumble through his small, ordered world with an expression that shifted slowly from wariness to something almost like amusement. She learned, in those first days, that the rhythms of Elias's world ran on a clock entirely different from the one she'd known her whole life. There was no calendar of galas, no assistant managing her hours down to the quarter minute. There was only the tide and the boat and Maya's school schedule and the small repeating tasks that kept a household running. Hauling water for the garden, mending torn nets, hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 crooked posts behind the house. Clara found herself, to her own surprise, drawn to the simplicity of it. There was a kind of honesty in work you could see the result of immediately, in a way there never had been in boardrooms full of men nodding along to numbers she suspected most of them didn't fully understand. She was terrible at nearly all of it at first. She scorched the bottom of Elias's good cast-iron pan trying to fry eggs. She hung an entire load of laundry inside out and didn't notice until Maya pointed it out, giggling behind her hands. She tried to weed the small vegetable patch behind the house and pulled up half of Elias's carrots along with the weeds, standing there afterward with dirt on her palms and an expression of such genuine dismay that Elias, watching from the porch, had to turn away to hide his laughter. "You've really never done any of this," he said, more to himself than to her, shaking his head as he came down to help her salvage what she could. "I told you I don't remember," Clara said, which was, again, technically not untrue, though the flush in her cheeks had less to do with confusion and more to do with the closeness of him kneeling beside her in the dirt. "You really don't remember anything," he said one evening, not quite a question, as she attempted, badly, to get a fish he'd brought in that afternoon. Apparently not how to do this, she said, and he laughed, a short, surprised sound, as if it had escaped before he'd given it permission, and took the knife from her hands and showed her, his fingers guiding hers, and neither of them mentioned how long they stood there afterward doing nothing at all. It was Maya who broke down the last of Clara's defenses in the unthinking way children do. She brought Clara wildflowers gathered from a bluff. She insisted Clara braid her hair, though Clara's first attempts were clumsy and had to be redone twice. She fell asleep once against Clara's shoulder during a storm that rattled the windows, and Clara sat very still for an hour afterward, unwilling to move and unwilling to examine too closely the tightness in her throat. Elias noticed. He noticed everything about his daughter, and he noticed, too, how she had begun to laugh more since the woman with no name had washed up on his shore. He told himself that was the only reason he found himself watching Clara across the dinner table, the only reason he'd started finding excuses to keep her near, mending nets, teaching her to read the tide charts, letting her ride along when he checked the crab pots at dawn. There had been smaller moments building toward it for days, the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder at the sink after dinner, not speaking, simply existing in the same easy quiet. Elias catching himself watching her across the room longer than any explanation of curiosity could account for. Clara finding excuses to stay near the boathouse in the evenings instead of retreating to bed the moment Maya was asleep. Neither of them named it. Both of them felt it, the way you feel a change in weather before the first drop of rain actually falls. The night everything shifted, they had been working together to patch a tear in the Seahawk's mainsail, kneeling close in the lamplit boathouse with Maya long asleep in the house above. Their hands brushed over the canvas. Neither pulled away. "You're not who you say you are," Elias said quietly, not accusing, just naming a truth that had settled over him gradually, like weather. "I don't know what you're running from, but I know you're not nobody." "No," Clara admitted, and it was the first wholly honest thing she'd said to him. "I'm not. Doesn't matter to me," he said, and meant it in that moment more than he'd meant anything in years. "Whoever you were before you washed up here, I like who you are now." She kissed him first, or he kissed her first. Afterward, neither of them could have said, only that it happened, sudden and inevitable as the tide. And for the length of that kiss, Clara Vance was not an heiress running from a murder attempt, and Elias Thorne was not a widower who'd sworn off ever risking his heart again. They were only two people who had found, against every reasonable expectation, something that felt like home. It could not last, of course, not hidden the way it was. 3 weeks after the storm, Julian Whitmore stood before a bank of cameras with grief arranged carefully on his face and announced a $2 million reward for information leading to the safe return of his beloved fiancée, presumed lost at sea. The broadcast ran on every channel, including the small television in the harbor bar where Elias sat waiting out a rain delay with 2 other captains, and he watched Clara Vance's photograph fill the screen with a stillness that frightened the men beside him. He did not say a word to anyone in the bar. He drove home in silence, and when he walked through his own front door and found her at the stove, humming to Maya's favorite song, he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he trusted himself to speak. "Clara Vance," he said, and watched her go pale. "That's your name, isn't it?" There was no more pretending after that. She told him everything. The documents, the forged signatures, the hand at her back in the storm, the fact that she had let him believe a lie for 3 weeks because she had been more afraid of Julian than of losing whatever this was between them. She had thought, telling herself this, that she was protecting him and Maya by staying quiet. She understood now, watching the anger and hurt move across his face, that she had only been protecting herself. "You let my daughter fall in love with a lie," Elias said, low and furious, the old walls slamming back up around him with a speed that told her how thin his trust had been all along. "You let me." He stopped himself, unwilling to finish the sentence, unwilling to hand her that much of himself when he'd just learned how easily she could keep secrets. "Billionaires. You people play games with things that are real to the rest of us." "I'm not playing a game," Clara said, and her voice broke on it. "I have never in my life felt as real as I do here with you and Maya. I was trying to survive. But the trust between them had cracked, and no amount of honesty offered after the fact could fully seal it again. He asked her, quietly, to sleep in the guest room instead of the room down the hall from his, and though she understood why, it felt like losing something she'd only just learned she had. The investigators found her 4 days later. Discreet men in dark cars who asked careful questions at the harbor and the general store. Men Clara recognized as Julian's, the same kind of quiet, competent people who arranged accidents on stormy nights and made them look like nothing at all. She watched them from the window of Elias's house and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that her presence there was no longer a secret kept. It was a danger brought to their door. She packed the few borrowed clothes she owned that same night. She left before dawn, before Maya could wake and ask where she was going, because she did not trust herself to say goodbye to the little girl's face without breaking completely. She left Elias a note instead, brief and inadequate, telling him only that she loved them both too much to let Julian's reach extend to their doorstep, and that leaving was the only way she knew to keep them safe. She turned herself in, if it could be called that, at her family's estate that afternoon, arriving unannounced in borrowed clothes with salt still in her hair, and watched Julian's carefully composed relief curdle into something colder the moment they were alone. He had not expected her to survive. He certainly had not expected her to return with nothing to say about where she'd been. Elias read her note, standing in his own kitchen with Maya, asking, over and over, where Ellie had gone, and something in him that had only just begun to soften went hard and bitter all over again. He told himself he was angry at her for leaving without a word. It took him longer than he'd like to admit to recognize that what he actually felt was fear. Fear that he had let his pride slam a door on the one thing that had made his house feel like a home again in 3 long years. Clara did not spend the weeks that followed as a victim waiting to be rescued a second time. She had spent a lifetime learning the mechanics of her family's company, even as she'd been kept from its true levers of power, and she used every scrap of that knowledge now. She reached out quietly to her father's old attorney, the one Julian didn't know existed. She tracked down the crew member who'd approached her on the yacht's deck, offered him immunity in exchange for testimony, and got it. She reconstructed, piece by piece, the paper trail Julian had built to steal a company and a life that were never his to take. It was not simple work. Julian had spent years building his position inside the company, cultivating loyalty among board members who owed their seats to his recommendations, and Clara found more than one door closed to her in those first weeks, more than one old family friend suddenly too busy to take her calls. She spent long nights in her father's study going through ledgers she barely remembered existed, teaching herself the language of the business she was supposed to have inherited outright, until the numbers stopped looking like a foreign country and started looking like a map. One that, if she followed it carefully enough, led directly back to Julian's own signature. The crew member had been the hardest thread to pull. He had vanished from the yacht's payroll within a week of the storm, paid off, and reassigned somewhere Julian clearly hoped she'd never think to look. It took a private investigator, 3 false leads, and a great deal of Clara's dwindling patience before she found him working dock security 2 states away. Frightened enough of what he'd done to talk the moment, she offered him a way out that didn't end in prison. The confrontation, when it came, happened in a boardroom rather than a courtroom, in front of the same board members who had toasted her engagement months before. Clara laid the documents on the table one by one. The forged signatures, the transfer agreements, the sworn statement from the man Julian had paid to push her overboard, and watched 2 decades of her fiancé's careful reputation collapse in the space of 20 minutes. He was escorted from the building by security before the meeting ended. The engagement, the board noted afterward, was over. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, standing alone in her father's old office that evening, surrounded by a wealth that had never once kept her warm, all she could think of was a small kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and a 6-year-old's laugh and a man whose hands had known exactly how to gut a fish and exactly how to hold her like she was something worth keeping. Elias, for his part, had spent those same weeks in a silence Maya found increasingly hard to bear. "You miss her," his daughter told him one evening, with the blunt clarity children specialize in, "and you're being stubborn about it, and I don't like it." He didn't argue with her. He'd been telling himself a version of the same thing for days. He had let a woman risk everything to keep his daughter safe, and he had answered that sacrifice with silence and wounded pride instead of the one thing that might have mattered, going after her. Clara came back to the coast on a clear morning in late autumn, driving herself this time, in plain clothes, with no entourage and no press trailing behind her. She found Elias down at the docks repairing a line, and she stood at the end of the pier for a long moment before he looked up and saw her. Neither of them spoke right away. There was too much to say, and not enough of it fit easily into words. "I'm not running from anything anymore," Clara said finally. "Julian's gone. The company's mine, properly, for the first time in my life. I could do anything I want with it." She took a breath. "Well, I want us to use it to help this town. Boat repairs, the school, whatever this harbor actually needs, instead of what someone in a boardroom thinks it needs. And I want to do it from here, if you'll have me." Elias set down the line in his hands and crossed the dock toward her, slow and certain, the way a man walks when he has finally stopped arguing with his own heart. "I was a fool," he said. "I let my pride talk me out of the best thing that ever washed up on this shore." "You saved my life," Clara said, laughing despite the tears in her eyes. "I think that evens things out." "Not even close," he said, and kissed her right there on the dock in the cold morning light, with no storm and no secret between them this time. Only Maya's delighted shriek from the top of the ramp as she came running down to throw herself into both their arms, certain, in the way only a child can be, that everything was exactly as it should be. They built their life from there in pieces that fit. Clara kept the company, but she ran half of it from a small office above the harbor store, and the coastal town that had once been barely scraping by found itself. Over the following year, with a repaired breakwater, a rebuilt school gymnasium, and a marina cooperative that kept every fishing family on the water solvent through the lean winter months. She never wore silk again if she could help it. She still burned the occasional breakfast, though considerably less often, and Elias never once let her forget the first time she tried to go to fish. Maya got a mother in every way that mattered, and eventually, on a spring afternoon with the whole town gathered on the very dock where Elias had once pulled a stranger from the sea, she got to be the flower girl at the wedding too, scattering petals with the fierce concentration of a 6-year-old. Now 7, determined to do the job exactly right. There was no yacht at that wedding, no towering cake flown in from some city neither of them cared to name, no guest list assembled for the cameras. There were fishing boats decked out in bunting, and long tables set up right on the pier, and a meal cooked by half the harbor's families working together in a kitchen far too small for the job. Clara wore a simple white dress she'd picked out herself, without a single stylist's opinion attached to it, and when she walked down the makeshift aisle toward Elias, she thought of the woman who had once stood on the deck of a much grander boat, feeling utterly invisible, and she felt, for the first time in her life, entirely seen instead. Julian's trial, when it finally concluded that winter, made headlines for exactly the length of time these things always do before the world moves on to some newer scandal. Clara read the verdict in the newspaper over breakfast, in the small kitchen that still smelled faintly of wood smoke, with Elias's hand resting warm over hers on the table, and found that it barely touched her anymore. He had tried to take everything from her once, her company, her safety, her sense of who she was worth being. He had failed to take the one thing that mattered. Some evenings, Clara still walked down to the end of the pier alone, just to stand where he had first found her looking out at the water, and think about how close she had come to never knowing any of this. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of a 6-year-old's laughter through a thin bedroom wall, the particular warmth of a man's hand finding hers without either of them needing to think about it. The company still ran, steady and profitable, but it no longer defined the whole of her. It was simply one more thing she managed well, alongside a household, a marriage, a daughter who now called her mom without a trace of hesitation, and a life she had never once imagined for herself back when her only measure of worth had been a number on a balance sheet. Clara Vance had spent her whole life being valued for what she was worth on paper. It took drowning and a fisherman's steady hands and a little girl's unguarded love to teach her what she was worth to the people who actually knew her. She had come to that small house on the bluff with nothing but a stolen name and a fear she couldn't outrun, and she left it, finally, not running from anything at all, only walking at last, toward exactly where she belonged.